There is a terrifying truth hidden beneath the fragile fabric of every family. Love, when neglected or poisoned by fear, can mutate into something unrecognizable. It can rot. It can strangle. It can devour the very people it was meant to protect. Stephen King knew this, perhaps better than any other modern storyteller. In The Shining, he peeled away the mask of the American family and revealed what happens when tenderness curdles into violence, when promises decay into obsession, and when the warmth of love becomes the very fire that burns the home down from within. A family is supposed to be the fortress where we retreat against the world, the place of safety, of shared meals, of laughter echoing down hallways. But what if that fortress becomes a trap? What if the walls begin to close in, the air grows heavy with silence, and the love that once held you together transforms into the chain that keeps you locked inside? King's genius was never in inventing monsters. It was in reminding us that the monsters we should fear most sleep in the room down the hall, at the same dinner table, inside our very own minds. Jack Torrance begins as every man who ever wanted redemption. He is flawed. He is bruised by failure. He is desperate to prove himself worthy of the titles husband and father. And yet, it is that desperation that makes him weak. Because desperation, in the quiet hours of winter, turns into a whisper, and the whisper becomes a voice, and the voice, when left unchecked, grows into madness. The Overlook Hotel is not just a haunted building. It is the echo chamber of Jack's own inadequacy. It feeds on his shame, his guilt, his temper, and transforms his frustrated love into a weapon. But isn't this what happens in so many homes, far from any haunted corridors? A father who believes love can be proven through control. A mother who confuses silence with peace. A child who learns too early that love is conditional, given only when one obeys, withheld the moment one resists. This is the real horror King was writing about. That love, if twisted by ego, addiction, or despair, becomes indistinguishable from hate. Love is supposed to nurture. Madness seeks only to possess. In Jack's case, the love he once felt for Wendy and Danny was suffocated by his inability to forgive himself. Every mistake, every drunken outburst, every reminder that he was not enough, he carried it like a disease. And diseases spread. His failures became their burden. His shame infected the very air of the house, until the walls themselves seemed to drip with it. How many families collapse this way? Not because of some external enemy, but because the father cannot look in the mirror without seeing his own monstrosity, and so he projects it onto those closest to him. Wendy is often seen as the victim, and she is, but she also embodies the silence that devours. Her love is endurance, her love is survival, but her silence is what allows Jack's madness to thrive. She knows he is breaking. She feels the violence long before it strikes. But she holds on. Believing love means to forgive endlessly, to endure without question. How many women have lived this same story? Believing that love is meant to suffer through bruises both visible and invisible. Believing that loyalty means standing beside the man even when he is already turned into a ghost of himself. Wendy's horror is not simply being trapped in the hotel. It is realizing that the home she fought for was already a haunted place long before the snow fell. And Danny, the child who sees too much. Every family has a Danny, the quiet one who absorbs the tension, who hears the slammed doors and feels the unspoken hatred vibrating through the walls. Children, more than adults, recognize when love has curdled because they live in the raw silence between words. Danny is the witness to the slow death of his family's love. He is also the victim of it, forced to carry visions of violence that no child should ever endure. How many children today still bear those invisible scars, learning to smile at school while their homes echo with rage at night? When love turns into madness, it does not announce itself with grand gestures. It arrives in whispers, the short temper at the dinner table, the dismissive silence that stretches for days, the drink to take the edge off, the laughter that sounds more like a sneer. By the time it explodes, the damage has already been done. The family has already been poisoned. King's story is a warning. Madness is not a lightning strike. It is a slow snowfall that buries you while you are still insisting that everything is fine. But perhaps the most chilling truth is this. Jack believed he loved his family, and in some fractured way, he did. But love without self-control, love without humility, love without honesty, is it still love? Or is it simply possession disguised as affection? How often do people hurt the ones they claim to love most, and then excuse it by saying, "I didn't mean it. You know I love you"? What King shows us is that love is not proven in words spoken after the violence. It is proven in the restraint before it. It is proven in the small choices, the moments of patience, the ability to sit with failure without turning it into punishment for someone else. And so the family horror buried in King's vision is not the ghosts of the Overlook. It is the way a father, a husband, a man, can lose himself so deeply in his own darkness that he drags his family down with him. It is the way a woman can confuse endurance with love until she forgets what freedom feels like. It is the way a child, too young to understand, is forced to carry the burden of adult sins. This is not fiction. This is the silent truth in too many homes. The real question King leaves us with is not whether Jack was weak, or Wendy was silent, or Danny was too young. The real question is this: when love in your own life begins to change shape, when it begins to sharpen into something that cuts instead of heals, will you recognize it? Or will you, like Jack, convince yourself that everything is fine until the walls are dripping with the blood of your denial? Madness, when it creeps into love, does not always appear monstrous at first. Sometimes it wears the mask of devotion. Sometimes it calls itself sacrifice. Think of Jack again, wandering those endless hotel corridors, convincing himself that all he wanted was to provide for his family, to secure their future, to write something that would prove his worth. On the surface, those are noble desires. Beneath the surface, however, they are fueled by ego, by a desperate need not to fail in front of his wife and child. Love that is shackled to pride is not love. It is a weapon waiting for an excuse to strike. How many fathers have believed they were protecting their families, when in truth, they were protecting only their own fragile sense of masculinity? How many mothers have remained silent, not out of love, but out of fear? Fear of breaking the illusion, fear of being alone, fear of being the one to admit that the dream of family has already collapsed. This is the horror King forces us to face, that love, when chained to fear, becomes indistinguishable from madness. The Overlook Hotel is the stage, but it is also the metaphor. Every family has its overlook, that one place, physical or emotional, where secrets are buried, where silence thickens, where unspoken resentments are left to rot. For some, it is the kitchen table where no one talks anymore. For others, it is the bedroom where a couple lies side by side in cold distance. For children, it may be the corner of the house where they hide while waiting for the storm to pass. The walls remember everything. The silence amplifies everything. And eventually, the family becomes haunted not by ghosts, but by themselves. King once said that monsters are real, and ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. That is the most frightening truth of all. The monster is not an outsider breaking in, but a loved one breaking down. Jack was not possessed by the hotel as much as he was possessed by his own failures, his own addictions, his own refusal to confront the darkness within. The hotel simply gave it a voice. Isn't this the same in real life? The alcohol does not create the violence. It only frees what was already simmering beneath the skin. The stress of work does not invent cruelty. It only unmasks it. When love turns into madness, it teaches us something about the fragility of human morality. None of us are immune. We like to believe we are different, that we would never harm the ones we love. But what happens under pressure? When failure echoes louder than hope, when addiction tightens its grip, when silence becomes unbearable? Madness does not arrive with a scream. It arrives with a whisper that says, "Just this once. You deserve it. They'll forgive you. You are right." And by the time you realize the whisper is lying, the damage is already carved into the people you swore to protect. The family horror is not simply violence. It is the erosion of compassion. Love dies not when someone raises a hand, but when patience runs dry, when empathy is replaced by resentment, when the other person becomes a burden instead of a partner. For Jack, Wendy became the reminder of his failures. Danny became the mirror of his inadequacy. And so, instead of seeing them as his salvation, he saw them as obstacles. Isn't that how madness always begins? When the ones you love stop being people in your eyes and start being symbols of your own pain? There is a quiet lesson buried here, one so human that it feels almost unbearable. If we do not confront our own darkness, if we bury it beneath silence, alcohol, work, or empty promises, then one day it will rise. And when it rises, it will not only consume us, it will consume the ones who love us most. This is why King's story feels less like fiction and more like prophecy, because every family, in some way, stands on the edge of that same abyss. The question is never whether the abyss exists. It always does. The question is whether we dare to look into it before it looks back at us. Jack refused. Wendy endured. Danny carried the burden. And in that silence, in that refusal, the love that once held them together became the very madness that tore them apart. So look at your own life for a moment. The people you love, the home you've built, the silences you've ignored. Ask yourself honestly, is your love still love? Or has it begun to change shape in ways you don't want to admit? Has your patience become resentment? Has your loyalty become fear? Has your desire to protect become control? If so, then maybe the horror King wrote about is not buried in the Overlook Hotel. Maybe it is buried in the human heart, waiting, quietly, to be recognized before it devours everything. There is a moment in every descent where love no longer speaks the language of care, but of control. That moment is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with a slammed fist or a shouted word. It arrives with a tone, a glance, a silence that freezes the air. Jack Torrance had many such moments, those quiet fractures where his frustration leaked into his family's fragile peace. He believed, as so many do, that love meant being obeyed, respected, deferred to. But respect rooted in fear is not respect at all. It is submission, and submission is the seed of destruction. What makes The Shining so devastating is not that Jack becomes a monster, it's that he was always human. His madness is believable, even familiar. Anyone who has felt failure pressing on their chest, anyone who has drowned their shame in alcohol, anyone who has hidden behind anger instead of vulnerability, can see themselves in him. He is not a stranger. He is the father, the husband, the man we all know. And that is what makes the family horror resonate. Love's betrayal does not come from strangers. It comes from the people we trust the most. Fear, too, is a twisted kind of love. Wendy fears Jack, yet clings to him because her love has become entangled with survival. She loves him not as he is, but as she remembers him, as she hopes he might be again. And in that tension between fear of what he is and love for what he was, she becomes trapped. How often do families live like this, holding on not to the present, but to a memory, a fragment of what once felt safe? This is the cruelty of love turned madness. It forces you to grieve the living, to mourn the person sitting across from you because the version you loved has already been consumed by something else. And then there is Danny, carrying the unbearable burden of seeing truth without having the power to change it. Children always know. They feel the tension before the blow is struck. They sense the absence in the silence, the violence in the air. Danny shines, yes, but even without his gift, every child shines in this way, absorbing what their parents cannot say out loud. It is why so many grow up with wounds invisible to the eye, wounds stitched together with silence. A slammed door, a broken bottle, a whispered argument behind thin walls. These are the hauntings of childhood, and they echo far longer than any ghost. Madness in a family is not just one person's fall. It is a ripple. Jack's rage becomes Wendy's terror. Wendy's silence becomes Danny's scars. Each absorbs what the other releases. This is the cycle that so many families know but never name. One person breaks, and the shrapnel lodges in everyone else. That is why King's story is less about a haunted hotel and more about the haunting of inheritance. Violence is passed down not always in fists, but in fears. Silence becomes a language. Rage becomes an heirloom. And love, the thing that was supposed to protect, becomes the very curse that binds. But beneath this horror is a plea, almost a prayer, that we must not confuse endurance with love, that we must not confuse control with care, that we must not confuse silence with peace. To love someone is not to consume them, or to endure them, or to bury pain beneath the carpet of domestic loyalty. To love is to face one's own darkness before it spreads. To love is to protect not only with arms, but with honesty. To love is to say, I am broken, but I will not break you with me. King understood that the truest horror is not the ghost in the hall, but the father whose hand trembles with rage, the mother who swallows her screams, the child who knows too much. Horror is not the supernatural. Horror is the moment love turns into its opposite, and nobody dares to say it out loud. So we return to the unanswerable question. How close are you, right now, to that threshold? How close is the love in your life to slipping into madness, not in explosions, but in silences, in habits, in whispered justifications? When you raise your voice in anger, do you tell yourself it's because you care? When you stay silent out of fear, do you call it loyalty? When you feel resentment bubbling, do you disguise it as patience? These are the Overlook Hotels of our own lives, not places of luxury and history, but prisons built from excuses and denials. And if Stephen King has taught us anything, it is this: every family is fragile. Every love must be tended like fire, warm enough to protect, but never left to rage unattended, because once love turns into madness, the home becomes a haunted house, and the people within it are never the same again. There comes a point in the story where the hotel is no longer just a backdrop. It becomes a mirror, amplifying what is already broken inside the Torrance family. And this is the same way life works outside of fiction. Stress, isolation, poverty, addiction, failure. They do not create monsters out of nothing. They reveal what was already waiting inside. They turn the cracks in love into chasms. They make silence louder, tempers sharper, fear more suffocating. Think of Jack pacing those hallways. He does not scream about love lost. He mutters about being disrespected, unappreciated, misunderstood. His love is warped by grievance. He confuses devotion with debt. He convinces himself that his wife and child owe him loyalty, simply because he is the one who provides. How many households fall into this same silent trap, where love becomes a ledger, where affection is measured not in care, but in obedience? A father believes he deserves respect because of his title. A partner demands silence in the name of keeping the peace. Love becomes a bargain, not a gift, and bargains, once broken, breed rage. Madness is not always explosive. Sometimes it is patient. Sometimes it is the father who never shouts but quietly withdraws, making the family tiptoe around his moods. Sometimes it is the mother who carries resentment in her body until it turns into sickness. Sometimes it is the child who stops speaking altogether because no one listens in The Shining. Madness manifests in Jack's violence. In real life, it manifests in absences of touch, of kindness, of apology. The family becomes a theater where everyone knows their role: the angry one, the silent one, the helpless one, and no one dares to change the script. But here lies the deeper terror. Love that turns into madness often feels inevitable. It whispers that all families are like this, that suffering is normal, that silence is better than conflict. It convinces us that to endure is to love. Wendy embodies this. She clings to the dream of family even as the reality crumbles around her. She tells herself that loyalty means staying, even when staying could kill her. How many people today are trapped in that same lie, convinced that leaving would be betrayal, when in truth, the betrayal was the violence long before the departure? And Danny, the child shining with the unbearable knowledge of what adults refuse to say, is the reminder that children are always witnesses. They do not need words to know when love has become poisoned. They feel it in the pauses, in the sighs, in the tension that thickens every room. They learn it in the way they are hugged less tightly, spoken to less gently, looked at less lovingly. They learn that love is fragile, unpredictable, dangerous. And they carry that lesson into their own futures, into their own families, into their own definitions of love. The cycle repeats. The horror becomes inheritance. This is why King's story is not simply about a haunted hotel, but about the haunting of memory. The hotel burns, but the trauma lingers. And isn't that true for us? Homes collapse, marriages end, families fracture, but the scars remain. The words spoken in anger echo for decades. The silence endured becomes a blueprint for how to love and how to suffer. The ghosts are not in the walls. They are in the blood. Yet, in this bleakness, there is still a warning worth heeding. Madness is preventable, but only when we confront the shadows within ourselves before they spread to others. Jack refused to face his weakness, so the hotel devoured him. How many of us refuse to face our addictions, our tempers, our silences, and in doing so, allow them to devour the very people we claim to love. To love, truly love, is to fight against that silence, to admit failure, to seek forgiveness before the damage hardens, to look at the ones who depend on us and say, "I will not let my darkness become your burden." That is the difference between Jack Torrance and the father, mother, partner, child who chooses to break the cycle. Love, without courage, curdles into madness. But love with courage, the courage to confront, to apologize, to change, can still save a family from becoming its own Overlook Hotel. And so, the question remains, one that cannot be escaped, one that King forces into our throats. When love in your life begins to shift into something darker, will you have the courage to face it? Or will you let it harden into silence until one day you no longer recognize the faces around your table? There is a terrible irony in love's transformation into madness. It almost always begins with the intention to protect. Jack wanted to protect his pride, his career, his role as husband and father. He wanted to shield his family from the humiliation of his failures, but protection, when twisted by fear and ego, becomes control, and control is never love. Control is fear disguised as devotion. Control says, "I will keep you safe, but only if you obey me." And that is not safety, it is captivity. The Overlook Hotel thrives on that captivity. The snow cuts them off from the world, but Jack's madness cuts them off from each other. He is trapped in his pride. Wendy is trapped in her silence. Danny is trapped in his visions. And isn't that what happens in so many homes? Families live together, but each member is trapped in their own isolation. The father hides in his anger. The mother hides in her endurance. The children hide in their rooms. They are together, but they are alone. And the house itself becomes colder, heavier, more haunted by the things unsaid. What King understood, what he laid bare in The Shining, is that love becomes madness not because of a single act, but because of accumulation. Resentments stacked like bricks, silences layered like dust, hurts ignored until they rot. Madness in families is rarely sudden. It is sedimentary, and by the time it erupts, it feels inevitable, as though it had been waiting all along. The true question, then, is not why Jack broke, but why he could not bend, why Wendy could not scream, why Danny could not be shielded. The tragedy of the Torrances is not that they faced a haunted hotel, but that they faced themselves and lost. And maybe that is the lesson we are meant to take, that every family must decide whether love will remain a fire that warms or a fire that burns. Fire does not choose its purpose. The hands that tend it do. Love, like fire, must be fed carefully, watched closely, respected constantly. Ignore it, and it will consume the house. Smother it, and it will die. So pause here, for just a breath, and imagine your own home, the voices you hear, the silences you endure, the gestures you make without thinking. Ask yourself, is your love still firelight, or has it become smoke? Do you still see the people closest to you as partners, or have they become obstacles, burdens, mirrors of your failures? Are you nurturing them, or are you demanding from them? The answers to those questions will tell you whether you are living in a home or in a haunted house of your own making, because in the end, King never wrote about monsters. He wrote about us, about the fragility of love, about the silence of families, about the thin line between devotion and destruction. And he left us with the hardest question of all. When love turns into madness in your life, will you recognize it, or will you, like Jack, convince yourself until it's too late that you are only doing it for love? Love that turns into madness is a love that forgets itself. It no longer asks, "How can I care for you?" but instead demands, "Why haven't you cared enough for me?" That is the shift. That is the crack in the foundation. Jack Torrance believed his suffering gave him the right to take more than he gave, to demand devotion without offering gentleness in return. His family became a mirror for his grievances, not a sanctuary for his tenderness, and that is when the home transformed into a cage. But this is not just Jack's story. It is the story of every household where affection mutates into obligation, where care becomes a test, where every conversation carries the weight of unspoken resentment. How many children grow up learning that love is conditional, measured by obedience? How many partners stay because they believe endurance is the purest form of devotion, even when devotion has long since rotted into fear? These are not haunted hotels. They are apartments in the city, houses in the suburbs, quiet kitchens filled with invisible ghosts. What Stephen King shows us is that the most terrifying monster is not the one lurking in shadows, but the one staring at us from across the dinner table. It is the father whose smile no longer reaches his eyes, the mother whose silence is louder than screams, the child who learns to stop asking for kindness because kindness never comes. This is the family horror, the erosion of trust, the death of safety, the betrayal of love, and yet, buried beneath this terror, there is a choice. Because madness is not destiny, it is a direction. It grows when silence feeds it, when denial shields it, when pride defends it. But it can be starved if confronted, if named, if stripped of its disguise. To say out loud, "This is not love anymore," that is the act of courage that separates a family that survives from a family that shatters. Jack could not take that step. Wendy could not break her silence until the violence was undeniable. Danny could not be spared the visions that scarred him, and so their love collapsed into madness, leaving nothing but ash and echoes. But we who live outside the story, are not bound to their fate. We can see in them the warning signs we ignore in ourselves. We can ask the questions Jack never dared, admit the truths Wendy swallowed, protect the innocence Danny was forced to carry. And that is where King's horror transforms into philosophy. Every reader, every viewer must walk away asking themselves not, what happened to the Torrances? but what is happening to me, because somewhere in our lives, there is a silence we have endured too long, a temper we have excused too often, a wound we have ignored until it festered somewhere. Love is in danger of becoming its opposite. So the question remains, pressing, impossible to shake. When the warmth of your own love begins to flicker into smoke, will you tend the fire, or will you watch in silence as it consumes the ones you cannot live without? The most unsettling truth in The Shining is not that Jack becomes violent. It is that his descent feels so natural, so plausible, that we can almost see ourselves in his footsteps. That is why King's story lingers long after the last page, because it whispers that love, no matter how strong, is never safe from corruption. Love is fragile. It demands vigilance. Without it, the line between care and cruelty blurs until no one in the family can tell which side they stand on anymore. Look closer at Jack's transformation. He tells himself he is sacrificing for his family, working to give them stability, pursuing a career that will one day make them proud. But underneath those excuses lies bitterness. He resents their dependence. He resents their reminders of his own failures. He resents the responsibility of being a father when he still feels like a child inside. And here lies the uncomfortable question King forces upon us. How often do we disguise our resentments as acts of love? How often do we say, "I'm doing this for you," when what we really mean is, "I need you to carry the weight of my disappointment." Wendy, too, becomes a mirror for so many who endure. She does not confront Jack until she has no choice. She believes love means forgiveness, that loyalty means suffering silently, that holding a family together is worth more than her own safety. Her love becomes martyrdom. And martyrdom, in a family, is just another name for slow destruction. How many mothers, wives, partners have lived like this, mistaking survival for devotion, mistaking endurance for compassion, mistaking fear for loyalty? Wendy's story is not fiction. It is repeated every day in homes we will never see. And then Danny, the child with eyes too wide, with silence too heavy. He is not only a boy with a gift. He is every child forced to feel the tension adults refuse to acknowledge. He shines because he listens, because he sees, because he feels the weight of words never spoken. Children always know. They always know when love has turned into something else. They carry those scars into adulthood, repeating or resisting them, but never forgetting them. Danny is not simply haunted by visions of ghosts. He is haunted by his parents' inability to love without destroying each other. The family horror King reveals is not an isolated tragedy. It is a cycle. Hurt becomes inheritance. Silence becomes language. Fear becomes legacy, unless someone breaks it. It passes from parent to child, generation to generation, like a curse no one dares to name. That is why the story feels so suffocating, because we know, deep down, that it is not just about the Torrances. It is about us. It is about the ways we excuse cruelty in the name of love, the ways we endure pain because we fear change, the ways we wound without realizing until it is too late. But here is the knife's edge of the lesson. It does not have to end that way. Madness is a path, not a prison. Silence can be broken. Cycles can be shattered. Love can be reclaimed, but only if it is stripped of its disguises. Only if we admit when it has turned into something else. only if we have the courage to say, "This is not love. This is fear. This is control. This is madness." That act of naming is the only exorcism strong enough to drive out the ghosts that feed on silence. So ask yourself now, not tomorrow, not someday when it's convenient, but now, in your own family, in your own heart. What has your love become? Is it still tenderness, still warmth, still patience? Or has it hardened into obligation, into resentment, into something you call devotion but feels more like captivity? Because the horror of the shining is not locked in the past. It is a warning, echoing still. Love, left unattended, will always risk turning into its opposite. And so we end with the question, king leaves burning in the snow. Will you recognize the moment when love begins to turn? Or will you, like Jack, convince yourself until the very end that madness is only another name for love? Then let us walk all the way into the heart of it, the truth that King drags into the light with brutal honesty. Love, in its purest form, is supposed to be selfless. It gives without tallying. It protects without demanding. It nurtures without consuming. But in the Torrance family, as in too many real families, love became transactional. Jack's love demanded obedience. Wendy's love demanded silence. Danny's love demanded endurance. None of it was free anymore. And when love is no longer free, it ceases to be love at all. It becomes madness disguised in familiar gestures. Think of how often we misuse the word love. A father shouts at his son, insisting it is discipline, insisting it is for the boy's own good. A mother stays in a broken marriage, convincing herself it is for the children. A partner smothers another with control, insisting it is protection. All of this is called love, but none of it is love. It is fear, pride, control, resentment, emotions dressed up in the costume of devotion. This is the masquerade King writes about, and it is the masquerade too many of us participate in every day. The tragedy is that Jack might have been saved. If only he could have faced himself. But he refused. He blamed the world. He blamed the hotel. He blamed his family. He never looked in the mirror long enough to admit, the monster is me. And so he became what he feared most. The axe in his hand was only the final symbol of what had already been true for years, that his love had sharpened into violence long before the snow began to fall. The horror is not that he fell. The horror is that he never even tried to rise. And that is the warning that should chill us. Madness is not inevitable, but it is always possible. It begins in silence, in resentment, in self-pity left to rot. It begins the moment we stop tending love like fire and start using it like a weapon. And if we refuse to admit that truth, then we, too, are only one winter away from our own Overlook Hotel. But there is another path. It is harder. It is humbler. It requires the courage Jack never had, the courage to admit weakness, to apologize before the wound festers, to step away from pride long enough to truly see the faces of those we love. It requires us to say, I will not let my failures become your burden. I will not let my shame become your inheritance. I will not mistake my fear for love. That is not easy, but it is the only way to keep love from becoming its own madness. And so we arrive at the door. King leaves open, not for Jack, not for Wendy, not for Danny, but for us. The story is finished, but the question is not. It lingers, heavy as snow, sharp as an axe, echoing through the halls of our own homes. When love in your life begins to turn, when it shifts from warmth to fire, from gift to demand, from care to control, will you recognize it? Will you have the courage to name it before it consumes everything you hold dear? Or will you, like Jack Torrance, mistake madness for devotion until it is too late? The answer does not belong to the story. It belongs to you.